Visions, angelic conflicts, prophecies, and the Antichrist. Today, on another episode of the Bible in 1 Year with the Preacher's Husband. Today we're going through Daniel chapter 10, 11, and 12. And tomorrow we're going to jump into the book of Ezra. We're going to go through chapter 1, 2, and 3. Now, as like yesterday, what I'm going to do today is go through a lot of the history of the prophecies that have been fulfilled, what has been fulfilled, how they were fulfilled, and then, of course, some of the ones that were not and what to maybe expect in the future. So let's dive right in. So this may be a long video, but I broke it up into sections. So if you want to watch it a section at a time, you feel free to do so. Here we go. All right, Daniel chapter 10. So this is a vision that Daniel receives, and he received this vision in about 536 BC, and he was approximately 84 years old at the time, if we use the same standards that we've been using to determine that time frame. The vision was about this great conflict in the future, and it was recounted in chapter 11 and verse 12. It's from chapter 11 verse 2 to chapter 12 verse 3. So this is a foreshadowing of what we're going to read in chapter 11. The last three chapters of Daniel are all about the same vision that he has. You get to verse 4. The Tigris River was some 20 miles from Babylon. So this is where this is taking place. Verses 5 and 6. Despite his similarity to Christ's appearance, as described in Revelation chapter 1, verses 12 through 16, the angel in the form of a man dressed in linen cannot have been the pre-incarnate Jesus Christ, because Jesus would not need help from the angel Michael to do anything, quite frankly. So this was possibly Gabriel, and there's a reason for that. And the reason why I say that I think this is possibly Gabriel. Verse 7, it says, only I, Daniel, saw the vision. His companions, they sensed a powerful and terrifying presence, but they didn't see anything, so they ran away and hid in those verses. Verses 8 through 11. Now, in verse 11 specifically, the phrase treasured by God is used. Now, this is the reason why I personally think that this was Gabriel, because this also occurred, the exact same verbiage here in chapter 9 verse 23, and this is what Gabriel said. So that makes me think that this is the same angel, because he's saying the same things. So verses 12 through 13 of chapter 10 here, the Persian prince had to be supernatural to oppose this angel in theory, and he had to be evil to oppose God's purposes, which is in reality. Therefore, we, in theory, can conclude that he was a demonic spirit seeking to influence the political affairs of Persia oppose God's purposes. This unnamed angel was able to prevail over the demonic associated with Persia only because the angel Michael came to help him, and I think that was possibly Gabriel. Michael, whose name means who is like God, is the guardian angel of Israel, as we've established, and he is designated as an archangel in the New Testament. If you look in Jude chapter 9, you'll see that. Verse 14, the angel here revealed that the first purpose of the vision was to reveal what would happen to Israel in the last days. Verses 15 through 19, the angel not only came to reveal the future, but to strengthen Daniel as well, first by his touch, and then secondly with his words of encouragement. I was thinking when I read this, I was thinking about today, how we are lacking in that area. We are lacking the physical touch part of encouragement. Encouragement entails two different things. One, physical contact, and two, words of encouragement. So both hearing and feeling to be encouraged. And how many hugs have you had lately from people that aren't in your immediate family because of all this COVID that's gone around? Very little. There's been very little human contact, and that's something that humans need. We need the handshakes, we need the hugs, we need the fist bumps. We need that human contact to encourage one another, and this is biblically true as well. So continue those words of encouragement. I encourage you to encourage others, even through the time when we can't physically touch, even though that is a necessity for us to be encouraged. Verses 20 and 21 here of chapter 10, the Prince of Greece is an allusion to the prediction that Greece would follow Persia as the next major world power. The angel's final purpose was to reveal what is recorded in the book of truth, which was a reference not to a particular earthly book, but to God's heavenly decrees about the future of all nations. So, this next section of our video is going to be chapter 11. So here we are in chapter 11 of Daniel. We're probably going to spend most of our time tonight here in this chapter. This chapter contains some of the most precise predictions in the entire Bible, and you're going to see as we go how precise these predictions really were when they came true and when they were fulfilled. In verse 1, right away, although the angel visited Daniel in the 3rd year of King Cyrus of Persia, and that happened in chapter 10, verse 1 just now, he revealed to Daniel that he had stood up to strengthen and protect Darius since the 1st year of his reign in 539 BC. Now, God is active in the political affairs of the world. I truly believe that. He is active in political affairs of the world. We may not understand why he's doing what he does, but I know that from reading this and from reading previous prophets that God uses not only his own people for his purposes, but he also uses the bad people for his purposes as well. So keep that in mind as we go forward. Verse 2, the 3 kings here in Persia were Cambyses, which was from 530 to 522 BC when he ruled. Pseudo-Smerdis was in 522 BC as well. And then Darius the first, also known as Hystaspes, was from 522 to 486 BC. Now, Ahasuerus was the 4th king who would be far richer than the others. Verse 3 and 4 here, the warrior king predicted here was Alexander the Great, who ruled from 336 to 323 BC. And as prophesied, his kingdom was divided to the 4 winds of heaven, referring to the division of his empire among his 4 generals that we talked about earlier in chapter 8, instead of his descendants. Verse 5, the king of the south is Ptolemy the First, or Souter of Egypt. That was he ruled from 323 to 285 BC, who was outstripped by one of his commanders. It says one of his commanders, who was Seleucus the First, or Nicator, also known as Nicator. So 311 to 280 BC is when he ruled. He had abandoned Ptolemy the First to become ruler of Babylonia, Media, and Syria, and established the Seleucid kingdom that grew to be greater than, remember the words greater than in verse 5, that of Ptolemy's Egypt. So, verse 6, we have the king of the south. This is Ptolemy the Second, or also known as Philadelphus. I guess that's where we get the name Philadelphia for the city. 285 to 246 BC was when he ruled, and he would make an alliance, as it says here, with the king of the north, who was Antiochus II, also known as Theos. He ruled from 261 to 246 BC, sealing the agreement by giving his daughter, the Ptolemaic princess Berenice, to marry Antiochus. Yet Berenice would not retain power as Antiochus's former wife, which was Laodice, would end up murdering Antiochus and Berenice and their child. So that's how that was fulfilled. Verses 7 through 9 here of chapter 11, one of Berenice's family, her brother Ptolemy III, also known as Euergetes, ruled from 246 to 211 BC. He would avenge her murder by storming Antioch, the fortress of the king of the north. Seleucus II, also known as Callinicus, who ruled from 246 to 226 BC. And he killed Laodice, the lady that killed Antiochus and his wife and family. So Ptolemy III would even seize the gods there and the valuables, bringing them all back to Egypt. In verse 10 here, the sons of Seleucus II are Seleucus III, also known as Cyrannus, and he ruled from 226 to 223 BC, and Antiochus III from 223 to 187 BC. They would wage war as far as the Ptolemaic fortress Raphia in southern Israel. In verses 11 and 12, the king of the south, Ptolemy IV, or he was also known as Philopator. I love these names. 221 to 203 BC was when he ruled, and he was of Egypt, who would counterattack the king of the north, which at this point was Antiochus III, who ruled from 219 to 218 BC. Now, although both would command large armies, the result would be a great victory for the Ptolemies. As a result of this success, Ptolemy IV will become arrogant, as it says here, become arrogant, and slaughter tens of thousands of Seleucid's troops. Yet he would not be able to maintain his dominance over the Seleucid kingdom. In verses 13 through 15 years later, the king of the north, as it says here, which was Antiochus III at this time, would raise an even greater army and attack Ptolemies in Phoenicia and Israel. Antiochus III would receive support against the king of the south, and Ptolemy V, also known as Epiphanes, who ruled from 203 to 181 BC, and the Ptolemies. So this support would come from Jewish rebels, here called violent ones among your own people. Violent ones among your own people. So Antiochus III's forces would win a resounding victory here, even capturing this well-fortified city of Sidon in 199 to 198 BC. Verses 16 and 17 here says the king of the north, which was Antiochus III, would make the beautiful land, which was Israel, a possession of the Seleucid kingdom in 198 BC, and force a peace agreement on the Ptolemies. Antiochus III, would give his daughter Cleopatra. His daughter was Cleopatra to Ptolemy V as a wife, and what he was hoping was to control the Ptolemaic kingdom through her. But this failed because Cleopatra, as we know, helped her Ptolemaic husband and did not stand with or support her father, Antiochus III. So in verses 18 and 19, Antiochus III would turn his attention to the lands around the Mediterranean Sea, but would be defeated by the Roman commander, who was Lucius Cornelius Scipio, however you pronounce that. And this was at Thermopylae. Okay, I love these names. 191 BC is when that happened. And then Magnesia in 190 BC. This would force Antiochus to focus on his own country, where he would stumble, fall, and be no more, as it's written here, being killed by a mob defending the temple of Zeus in Elymaeus, as Antiochus tried to pillage it. We get to verse 20, and this is the king who would rise in his place was Seleucus IV, also known as Philopator, as we talked about, who ruled from 187 to 175 BC, who would send his tax collector Heliodorus to collect money, which to pay the heavy indemnity he owed to Rome. After his very short reign, Seleucus IV was killed, not in anger or in battle. See where it said in this verse, not in anger or in battle, but instead we know that from history that he was killed by poison from his tax collector. His tax collector poisoned him. So verses 21 through 35 here, in summary, we're going to get into a little deeper stuff. Antiochus the fourth, which was Epiphanes from 175 to 163 BC, was the little horn in chapter 8. He's emphasized in this section because he would have a terrible and oppressive effect on the Jewish people in the near term. And his reign is a picture of the future world ruler, or the Antichrist. So the things that he is doing are very similar to what we're going to see the Antichrist do in the future, who's also going to oppress the Jewish people. So in verse 21, Antiochus IV was not of the royal line, but he took control by intrigue, while their rightful heir, Demetrius, was held in Rome. The prediction here called a despised person because of his hatred of the Jewish people, his attempt to destroy Judaism, his desecration of the temple, and his megalomania displayed in calling himself Epiphanes, essentially because Epiphanes meant the manifested one or the illustrious one. So people of that time, instead of calling him Epiphanes, they would also call him Epimanes. I love these names. Epimanes. Epimanes, which means madman. Epimanes. So instead of Epiphanes, they call him Epimanes, which means madman. So that's probably true because he sounds like a pretty crazy dude. So, chapter 11, verse 22, Ptolemy IV, or Philometor, we'll just call him that, 181 to 146 BC, was attacking with a flood of forces, as it says here. Antiochus IV would be able to defeat them and depose the covenant prince, or the Jewish high priest, Onias III. Verses 23 and 24, Antiochus IV would increase in power by sharing the wealth of his conquests, lavishing plunder, loot, and wealth on his followers, as it says here. In verses 25 and 26, you see the plots against him and the army to be swept away. Well, this verse refers back to the war with Ptolemy the sixth, predicting that not only would the power of Antiochus IV defeat Ptolemy the sixth, but also that plots against him would cause his army to be swept away. In verses 27 and 28, after the defeat of Ptolemy VI, Ptolemy VII took control of Egypt. Then the other two kings, Antiochus IV and Ptolemy VI, would meet, speaking lies at the same table, to plot Ptolemy VI's restoration to the throne. Now, after initial limited success, they eventually failed in this endeavor. Then Antiochus IV, the king of the north, having plundered Egypt, would return to his land with his heart set against the Holy Covenant. On the way home, he would attack Israel, killing 80,000 Jewish men, women, and children, and plunder the Holy Temple in 169 BC. In verses 29 and 30 here, Antiochus IV would launch another attack against Egypt, but this time ships of Kittim. We read about that in Numbers 24, actually. The Roman fleet led by Gaius Populus Laenas would force him to withdraw in humiliation. Verses 31 through 32, Antiochus IV would once again attack Israel in 167 BC, while returning to Syria, this time desecrating the temple in Jerusalem. Antiochus would prefigure the future Antichrist actions. In other words, the Antichrist that we're going to see is going to do this same thing. And he did this by abolishing regular sacrifices, committing an abomination of desolation, as it says in this verse, in response to the people who know their God will take action, as expressed in the Maccabean revolt that we read about in chapter 8. Now, the Maccabees, in verse 33 through 35, the Maccabees would experience suffering in their battle with Antiochus. In the end, we're talking about the end times here, the Maccabees would defeat Antiochus, or the end of that war, rededicate the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, and establish the festival of Hanukkah, or Chanukah, which means the festival of dedication, which the Lord Jesus actually celebrated in John chapter 10, verse 22, and the Jewish people still observe that holiday today. So verses 36 through 45, at this point, the predictions shift away from Antiochus IV, and they start focusing on the end of days. So this is going to be future time. The king mentioned in this section is the future Antichrist, who is already identified as the little horn and the coming ruler. These verses provide, this is verse 36 through 39, they provide a clear description of the future Antichrist, The God desired by women here, the desire of women, maybe a reference to the longing of Jewish women to give birth to the Messiah. In verses 40 through 44, during the Great Tribulation, the Antichrist will be attacked in a pincer movement, so kind of a squishing movement. Basically, where the armies came from both the north and the south to kind of pinch him in together. Yet he's going to be successful. He's going to sweep through like a flood, and he will also invade Israel, the beautiful land, ignoring some nations that are in alliance with him, but conquering others, including Egypt, Libya, and Sudan. Now, reports of nations from the east and the north coming to attack will both terrify and infuriate him, leading him to pursue a course of genocidal warfare against his enemies, especially many of the Jewish people. Now, we talk about genocidal warfare against the Jews. That's why a lot of people read this and refer to Hitler, but the more and more you read this, the less it refers to Hitler, in my opinion. And verse 45, right here at the end of chapter 11, the Antichrist will establish his military capital in Israel, pitching his royal tents between the Mediterranean Sea and the city of Jerusalem, situated on the beautiful holy mountain. There the nations of the earth will gather at Mount Megiddo to begin the campaign of Armageddon, as we will read in Revelation chapter 16. At that time, when the nation of Israel calls on the Messiah Jesus, he will return, as it states in Matthew chapter 23, verse 37 through 39, to deliver them, and the Antichrist will meet his end with no one to help him. At least there's going to be a happy ending, right? That's right. Now we'll move on to the next section of our video. If you need to take a break, because I know we've been here a while. If not, here we go, chapter 12. So here we are, chapter 12. Now, verse 1, right off the bat, at that time, as it says, at that time, Michael the great prince who stands watch over your people will rise up. At that time here refers to the events predicted in the previous paragraph, or verses 36 through 45 of chapter 11, which details the Antichrist's furious attempt to destroy and annihilate the Jewish people. Then the archangel Michael, who stands watch over the Jewish people, will rise to their defense to preserve them. This will be necessary because the Great Tribulation, which is the second half of Daniel's 70th week, remember we looked at that timeline of the 70 weeks, this will be a time of unprecedented distress, essentially is what it's referring to. Despite the horrific nature of the persecution of Israel, the result will be that the surviving remnant of the Jewish nation will turn in faith to their Messiah, Jesus. We actually read about that in Zechariah chapter 12, verse 10, and Romans chapter 11, verse 25 through 27. And he will deliver them. Jesus is going to deliver them. The book here refers to the heavenly book of life, in which the names of the elect are listed. Verse 2, following the deliverance of Israel, there will be a resurrection of those who sleep in the dust, as you see on your screen here. The word sleep is used as a metaphor to emphasize the temporary state of bodily death before being physically raised at the resurrection. Although telescoped together here, as is common in prophecy, the resurrection of the faithful and the unfaithful are two distinct events separated by a 1,000-year messianic kingdom, as we'll read in Revelation chapter 20, verses 4 through 6. Daniel 12:2 here contains the clearest statement of the resurrection in the Old Testament. And to me, when I talk to people who have literally passed away and been brought back to life, I've talked to multiple people about that this has happened to, and each one of them personally has told me that they felt like they were aware, but they were very at peace and they were resting. It was dark, but they had this awareness that other people were there, but they didn't really hear anything, didn't really see anything. It was just dark, but it was peaceful and relaxing, and it was the most peaceful and relaxing rest or place they have ever been to. So that gives me hope. That makes me think that that's exactly what the Old Testament here is referring to, is that time where you go to rest until you are resurrected at the end when all this comes to be. So, verse 3, the phrase, those who have insight, refers to those with the wisdom to turn in faith to the Messiah Jesus. As a result, they will lead many others to faith and righteousness. Verse 4, although it is possible that Daniel was told to keep these words of the vision secret, an alternative rendering of the Hebrew is to close up the words and seal the book, a reference to preservation of the text of Daniel until the time of the end. Preserving Daniel's prophecy was necessary because in the end days, many will roam about, as it says in the Bible verse here, seeking answers that will be found in the book of Daniel. Moreover, in that day, knowledge will increase. This is possibly referring to the understanding of Daniel's prophecies, as informed observers would recognize the fulfillment of his predictions as they're happening. So, Daniel chapter 12, verses 5 through 7, Daniel sees two others here. This means angels who served as witnesses for the oath of the linen-dressed angel that we saw in chapter 10, verse 5. Now, if you recall, 2 was the minimum number of witnesses that were necessary for an oath to be taken. You had to have a minimum of 2 witnesses, and that was in Deuteronomy chapter 19, verse 15. That was in their law. So one of the witnessing angels asked, how long until the end of the predicted time of distress? And the angel dressed in linen answered that the time of the great tribulation, the second half of Daniel's 70th week, would be for a time, times, and half a time, which means or 3.5 years. So by the end of the great tribulation, the power of the holy people of Israel will be shattered, causing them to turn in faith to their long rejected Messiah, Jesus. And we'll read about that in Zechariah chapter 12, verse 10. At the time, they will return and deliver them. He will return and deliver them. Jesus will. And all these things will be completed. Now, verses 8 through 10, Daniel's statement that he heard but did not understand means that he did not understand exactly how these events would happen, but Daniel was told to go on his way because the words are secret, or they're closed, and they're sealed until the end of time, meaning that they would not be fully recognized until their fulfillment at the end of days. And at that time, the wicked will fail to comprehend their situation. The people that aren't familiar with these prophecies and aren't familiar with the Bible, they won't understand what's going on. They'll have no idea. But it says here that, but those who have insight will understand the fulfillment of Daniel's words and turn in faith to God of Israel and his Messiah, Jesus. Now, verses 11 and 12, there are 2 periods of time that were revealed to Daniel. First, from the middle of the tribulation, when the Antichrist stops daily sacrifices, and then he commits the abomination of desolation, until the end, there will be 1,290 days. Okay, so it says 1,290 days here. The Great Tribulation is said to be 3.5 years. Well, 3.5 years is pretty close to 1,290 days, right? And that was in verse 7. Well, or 1,260 days. So in Revelation chapter 12, verse 6, and chapter 13, verse 5, it says 1,260 days. Well, here, the 1,290 days is actually about 30 days longer. Now, that's probably to include the time for the judgment of the nations that was mentioned in Matthew chapter 25, verse 31 through 46, if you want to go down that rabbit hole too. So second, a blessing awaits the one who reaches 1,335 days. So if you can make it that long, this was a period that included not only the 30 days for judging the nations, but also an additional 45 days, perhaps to establish the government of the Messianic kingdom at that time. Those who enter the kingdom are said to be happy because they will be part of the most glorious world governed by its greatest king, the Lord Jesus Christ himself. And of course, last but not least, verse 13 of chapter 12, the angel told Daniel that he was to continue to the end of his life, at which point he would rest, which is a euphemism for death, yet he was given the promise that he too would stand, that is, rise from the dead at the end of time. That too is very encouraging words from the book of Daniel. So, I hope this has helped you along with your studies. I spent a lot of time doing this historical research and stuff on this book, and I hope so. I hope this helps you along the way with understanding a little bit of the book of Daniel and the prophecies that are included there, and what they mean to us in our daily lives, and what it means for our future, and how there is hope in our future, and it's going to be a glorious, I guess, resurrection when it comes to that day. I hope this has touched you. If it has, click the like button, the subscribe button. Of course, click the little jingle bell so you can get notified the next time I upload a video. And hit that little boxing glove so you can rumble with me on Rumble. And I will see you again tomorrow for another episode of the Bible in 1 Year with the Preacher's Husband. And it will definitely not be as long of a video as today's was. We'll see you then.